Your people's lies end here.
The orbital elevator before the mops its shields.
Scanning this sector with thermal.
Eagle team, did you breach the reactor core?
Stay back!
Take it, we need the reactor. They're here, secure the reactor core. Abandon ship.
The council chamber went silent the moment our shuttle doors opened, and I knew before anyone spoke a single word that we were not welcome here. My name is Ethan Cole, and I served as communications officer aboard the first human vessel ever permitted past the border of council space. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. We did not go to that meeting looking for a fight. We went because for the first time in human history, we had been invited to sit at a table with the rest of the galaxy. We believed, foolishly perhaps, that this was the beginning of something good. I remember stepping off the shuttle behind Ambassador Grace Bennett, watching her spine straighten as dozens of alien eyes turned toward us. The chamber was enormous, built from a pale stone that seemed to hum faintly under the lights, and every species in the room had a raised platform, a translator drone, a designated place. Every species except us. We were led to a bench near the back, low to the ground, positioned so that we had to look up at everyone else when we spoke. I caught the eye of a delegate from a species I did not recognize, tall and thin with skin like polished silver, and he did not bother hiding his amusement. He leaned toward the delegate beside him and said something I could not hear, and both of them laughed in that particular way that needs no translation. I felt my jaw tight, but Grace placed a hand lightly on my arm, a silent reminder that we were guests, and guests do not make scenes. The proceedings began with a formal welcome that felt anything but formal. The presiding council member, a broad-shouldered being called Speaker Doran Vex, addressed the chamber in a booming voice that the translator rendered into flat, clinical English. Before us today, he said, is a delegation from a species recently arrived at the threshold of interstellar travel. Their homeworld records show a history marked by repeated internal conflict, resource scarcity, and what our analysts describe as chronic instability. We extend to them, as is customary, an invitation to observe our assembly. Observe, not join, not participate, observe, like children brought to watch adults conduct real business. Grace stood to respond, and I watched her choose every word carefully. She spoke of humanity's achievements, our advances in science and cooperation, the centuries we had spent slowly learning to work together despite our differences. She spoke with dignity, and for a moment, I believed she might actually change the mood in that room. Then the laughter started again, quieter this time, more polite, which somehow made it worse. A delegate near the front, a squat creature draped in ceremonial fabric, raised a limb and asked through the translator whether it was true that humans had fought more than 100 organized conflicts on their own world within the last 2 centuries alone. Grace answered honestly, because lying was not something our delegation had been authorized to do. Yes, she said, that was true, but it was also true that humanity had used that same history to build institutions that prevented conflict from consuming us entirely. The delegate did not seem to hear the second half of her answer. He turned to the delegate beside him and made a comment that the translator rendered as remarkable that such a fragile species survived itself long enough to build a starship. I sat there absorbing every syllable of it, and I felt something settle deep in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with clarity. These beings did not see us as equals. They saw us as a curiosity, a cautionary tale, a species to be studied from a safe distance and quietly managed if we ever became inconvenient. The session continued for nearly 2 hours, and in that time I watched our ambassador denied a formal seat no fewer than 3 times. Each time the council found some procedural reason. Each time the silver-skinned delegate and his companions exchanged glances that needed no translation at all. It was near the end of the session, when most of the chamber had grown bored with us, that something changed. A smaller figure approached the central podium, cloaked in deep blue robes that marked her, I would later learn, as a senior archivist of the Council's ancient charter. She did not look at us with mockery. She looked at us the way someone looks at a puzzle they have not yet decided whether to solve. "There is a clause," she said, and the chamber went quiet in a different way this time, an attentive way, buried in the founding charter of this council, rarely invoked in recent memory, which states that any species reaching the threshold of interstellar travel may be formally assessed before full consideration for membership. Speaker Vex's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into practiced calm. "The clause you reference has not been invoked in over 3 centuries, he said. "It has not been repealed either," the archivist replied. I did not understand yet what this meant, not fully, but I felt the temperature in the room shift. Grace glanced back at me, and I could see the same question in her eyes that was forming in mine. What exactly were they about to propose? The archivist continued, her voice steady and precise. "The trial of threshold requires the candidate species to demonstrate readiness through a structured, monitored engagement against a council-designated proxy force. It exists to determine whether a new species possesses the discipline, restraint, and stability necessary for full standing among us." Restraint. I turned that word over in my mind, even as the silver-skinned delegate from earlier let out a short, sharp laugh that he did not bother to disguise. "A fitting test," he said, "for a species with such a colorful history of violence." The chamber murmured its agreement, and I understood then that this was not really about assessment at all. This was about humiliation dressed up as procedure. They expected us to refuse. They expected Grace to stand up offended and withdraw our petition for membership, proving their point about our instability in the process. Or if we somehow agreed, they expected a quick and humiliating defeat that would confirm everything they already believed about us. I watched Grace closely as she considered her response. She had spent 30 years in diplomatic service before this mission, and I had never once seen her rattled. Not by budget committees, not by hostile press, not by anything. But this was different. This was a room full of beings who had already decided who we were before we opened our mouths. She rose slowly, and the chamber fell silent again, waiting. "Humanity accepts the trial of threshold," she said. The reaction was immediate. Not shock exactly, more like satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction a predator feels when prey walks willingly into an open trap. Several delegates exchanged looks of quiet amusement. Speaker Vex nodded slowly, as though this outcome had been anticipated all along. "Very well," he said. "The Council will designate a proxy force and a location. Terms will be transmitted to your homeworld within the cycle." I leaned toward Grace as the session began to close, keeping my voice low. "Ma'am, do we actually know what we just agreed to?" She did not look at me right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the council members filing out of the chamber, still laughing quietly among themselves, still certain of how this would end. "No," she said finally, "but I know what they think we agreed to, and I have a feeling they are about to learn something about us that none of their records can predict." I did not fully understand what she meant in that moment. I only knew that something had shifted, something larger than a single meeting or a single insult. Walking back to our shuttle through corridors lined with alien architecture, past beings who watched us with expressions ranging from curiosity to open contempt, I found myself thinking not about the humiliation we had just endured, but about what would come next. Because for all their ancient charters and polished chambers and careful procedures, the Council had made one critical error. They had studied our history of conflict and concluded that it made us dangerous to ourselves. They had never once considered what centuries of hard lessons might have taught us about surviving against something else entirely. As our shuttle lifted away from the Council homeworld, I looked out the viewport at the fading lights of that ancient chamber and felt, for the first time since we arrived, something other than humiliation. I felt the quiet, cold certainty that we were about to be badly underestimated, and that the beings who had just laughed at us were not going to enjoy finding that out. Grace sat beside me in silence for most of the journey home, her expression unreadable. Her mind clearly working through calculations far beyond diplomatic protocol. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, the way it always was right before she said something important. "Ethan," she said, "send a priority message to Earth Command. Tell them the invitation we hoped for did not come. Tell them what came instead." I nodded and turned to my console, already drafting the words in my mind, already aware that whatever message I sent would set something in motion that none of us in that chamber, ourselves included, could yet fully understand. The stars outside the viewport looked the same as they always had, distant and indifferent. But something in the air aboard our small ship had changed. A quiet tension settling into every corner of the vessel. The feeling of a door closing behind us and another one, much larger and much darker, beginning to open ahead. None of us spoke of it directly during that long journey home. We did not need to. Every member of our small crew understood in their own way that the Council had just made a decision they would spend a very long time regretting, and that humanity, for better or worse, was about to answer that decision on our own terms. The message reached Earth Command 11 hours before we did, transmitted at maximum priority through relay stations that had never before carried anything this urgent from outside our own solar system. By the time our shuttle finally docked at the orbital station above Earth, I could already sense that something had changed down on the surface. The usual chatter on the comm channels had gone quiet, replaced by clipped, efficient exchanges between officers who clearly understood the weight of what was coming. I was summoned to the war room less than 2 hours after we landed, still wearing my travel uniform, still carrying the fatigue of the long journey home. The room itself was unlike anything I had seen in my career. A wide amphitheater buried deep beneath a mountain range, its walls lined with screens displaying star charts, fleet positions, and data feeds scrolling faster than I could read. Dozens of officers moved between stations with quiet purpose, and at the center of it all stood Commander Henry Blackwood, a man whose reputation for calm precision under pressure was well known throughout the service. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment his expression was unreadable. Then he gestured for me to take a seat near the central table, where Grace was already waiting, still composed despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face. "Ambassador Bennett has briefed me on what happened," Blackwood said without preamble. "I want to hear it again from you, Lieutenant Cole. Every detail, every word." I recounted the meeting as precisely as I could remember it. The dismissive tone of the delegates, the archivist's introduction of the trial of Threshold, the quiet certainty in the room that we would either refuse or fail. Blackwood listened without interrupting, his eyes narrowing slightly at certain points, his jaw tightening when I described the laughter that had followed Grace's acceptance of the trial. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying the star charts glowing on the wall behind him. "They believe this is a formality," he said finally, "a ritual designed to keep newcomers in their place. A demonstration meant to remind young species of their limitations before they are permitted to feel equal to their elders." "That was my impression as well," Grace said. Blackwood nodded slowly. "Then they have made a mistake that very few species in this galaxy have ever had the chance to make. They have offered humanity a formal, sanctioned reason to demonstrate exactly what we are capable of, and they have done so without understanding what our history actually taught us." I did not fully grasp what he meant until the briefing continued, and officers began pulling up files I had never seen before. Records from a classified division devoted entirely to what they called continuity doctrine. It was, I would come to understand, the accumulated military and strategic knowledge of a species that had spent thousands of years fighting itself before finally learning, through immense cost, how to fight only when necessary, and how to fight decisively when that necessity arrived. Blackwood explained it to the room with the patience of a teacher addressing students who had never considered the subject before. Every other species the Council had encountered, he said, had developed their military doctrines under vastly different conditions. Some had unified early under single governments and rarely faced true internal conflict. Others had evolved cooperative instincts so strong that large-scale organized violence was almost unknown to them. Their conflicts, when they occurred at all, tended to be limited, ritualized, bound by unspoken rules that both sides understood and respected. Humanity had never been afforded that luxury. Our history was long and difficult, filled with mistakes and tragedies that we had spent centuries trying to correct. But it had also forged something the rest of the galaxy simply did not possess: We understood, in a way few other species could, how to organize massive efforts toward a single decisive goal. We understood logistics on a scale built for surviving conflicts that spanned continents. We understood that half measures in a serious conflict often caused more suffering than swift, overwhelming resolution. They are expecting a duel, Blackwood said. A contained skirmish with agreed-upon boundaries, the kind of engagement that has defined every trial of threshold in the Council's recorded history. They are not expecting an opponent who treats the exercise as an actual conflict to be resolved as quickly and completely as possible. I sat there absorbing this, feeling the shape of what was coming begin to take form in my mind. This was not going to be a fair fight in any sense the Council understood, and yet I found myself troubled by an unexpected thought. Grace must have noticed something in my expression, because she turned to me with quiet understanding. "You are wondering whether this is the right path," she said. I hesitated before answering. "I am wondering whether we are about to prove every terrible thing they already believe about us." Blackwood's expression softened slightly at that, the first crack in his otherwise composed exterior. "That is a fair question, Lieutenant, and one this command has debated at length in the hours since your message arrived. Let me offer you a different way of looking at it." He pulled up a new display, a simulation of the Council's historical trials, dozens of them stretching back centuries. In each case, the newcomer species had either declined the trial entirely, accepting a lesser, more restricted status within Council space, or had engaged in the ritualized skirmish and lost, their induction delayed by decades while they proved themselves through smaller, safer means. In every recorded case, Blackwood continued, the trial was designed to be survivable, not winnable in any meaningful sense. Newcomers are expected to demonstrate courage and discipline, not victory. The Council does not actually want new species to succeed quickly. A quick success threatens the established order among their long-standing members. A managed failure, however humiliating, keeps that order intact. I understood then what he was truly saying. This was never meant to be a fair test of readiness. It was a mechanism for keeping ambitious newcomers in a permanent state of controlled disadvantage, forced to prove themselves again and again through smaller trials, while established Council members maintained their position at the top of a hierarchy built to favor them. "So what happens," I asked slowly, "if we do not play by their expectations at all?" Blackwood allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. "That, Lieutenant, is precisely the question this command intends to answer." Over the following days, I watched Earth Command mobilize resources in a way I had never witnessed in my career. Fleet assets that had spent years in development for purely defensive purposes were suddenly repositioned. Logistics divisions that had planned for worst-case scenarios involving asteroid strikes and long-range threats were now applying those same calculations to a confirmed engagement with a designated adversary. Strategists who had studied centuries of human conflict, not to celebrate it but to understand its patterns, were brought into rooms usually reserved for diplomatic planning. I found myself increasingly involved in these preparations, not because my rank warranted it, but because Blackwood seemed to value having someone present who had witnessed the Council's contempt firsthand. He told me privately one evening, a reminder in the room of exactly what we were responding to, so that no one lost sight of the stakes in the abstraction of strategy and simulation. During one of these late sessions, I met a woman named Claire Donovan, a logistics officer with a quiet intensity that reminded me of Grace in certain ways. She had spent years studying supply chain resilience, and she explained to me in terms I could actually follow why the coming engagement mattered so much beyond the immediate insult we had endured. "Every other species the Council deals with fights the way they live," she said, sketching diagrams on a data pad as she spoke. "Careful, limited, protective of resources, they have never had to strain to their absolute limit. We are different. Our entire strategic tradition was built by necessity, by generations who had to learn how to sustain massive coordinated efforts under conditions of genuine scarcity and genuine threat." I asked her what that meant in practical terms, and she looked at me with an expression that was not quite a smile. "It means when the Council's proxy force meets ours, expecting a careful, bounded skirmish, they will instead meet an opponent who understands, on an instinctive level bred from thousands of years of hard experience, how to commit fully to a decisive resolution. They believe our history makes us reckless. They have not considered that it might instead make us disciplined in a way none of their careful, comfortable histories ever required. I thought about the silver-skinned delegate's laughter, the archivist's careful proposal, Speaker Vex's practiced calm, as he agreed to designate a proxy force certain of the outcome. I thought about the centuries of quiet condescension embedded in every word spoken in that chamber, and I felt something harden in me that had not been there before. We were not going to that engagement seeking violence for its own sake. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. Every officer I spoke with during those preparations expressed the same quiet resolve, the same hope that this demonstration would be enough to end the matter swiftly with minimal cost to anyone involved. But there was also an unmistakable understanding running through every briefing, every strategy session, every quiet conversation in the corridors of that underground command center. We had been dismissed, mocked, and underestimated by beings who believed their ancient charters and comfortable hierarchies made them untouchable. They were about to discover exactly how wrong that belief was. Grace found me one evening in the observation deck above the command center, staring out at the lights of the fleet gathering in orbit, ships I had never seen deployed together in such numbers. She stood beside me quietly for a while before speaking. "Do you remember what the archivist said," she asked, "about the purpose of the trial? Discipline and restraint." "I remember," I said. "I have been thinking about that word, restraint, quite a lot these past few days," she continued. "The Council believes restraint means holding back, staying within careful boundaries, never committing fully to anything. But I wonder if they have confused restraint with hesitation." I turned to look at her, waiting for her to continue. "Humanity spent centuries learning the difference," she said. "We learned that true restraint is not about avoiding difficult choices. It is about making those choices decisively when necessary, so that the difficulty does not have to be repeated. I believe we are about to teach the Council a lesson about that distinction that none of their histories ever prepared them to learn." I did not respond right away. I simply stood beside her, watching the fleet continue to gather beneath the stars, feeling the weight of everything that was coming settle over me like the quiet before a long-awaited storm. Somewhere out among those distant systems, the Council was almost certainly congratulating itself on a clever plan to remind humanity of its place. They had no idea that the plan they believed would humble us was instead about to reveal exactly what centuries of hard-earned discipline could accomplish when finally given a legitimate reason to act. The order to depart came 7 days after our return from the Council homeworld, faster than I expected given the scale of what Earth Command had assembled in that short window. I stood on the observation deck of our new flagship, a vessel called the Resolute, watching the last support ships fall into formation around us as the fleet prepared for departure. It was strange to think that only a week earlier I had been sitting on a low bench in an alien chamber, listening to beings who considered us barely worth their attention. Now, I stood aboard the most advanced vessel humanity had ever built, preparing to answer that dismissal in the only language the Council seemed capable of respecting. Commander Blackwood had been given direct command of the engagement, a decision that surprised no one who had watched him work during the preparation phase. I had been assigned to the Resolute's bridge crew as communications and intelligence liaison, a role that placed me close enough to witness every major decision as it unfolded. Grace remained aboard as well, serving now not merely as a diplomat but as an observer whose testimony would matter greatly once this engagement concluded, whatever the outcome. In the days leading up to departure, I had spent considerable time studying the briefings prepared by Claire Donovan and her logistics team, along with strategic assessments compiled by officers who had devoted their careers to understanding exactly how conflicts of this scale needed to be fought, and more importantly, concluded. What struck me most was not the weaponry or the ship designs, impressive as they were, but the underlying philosophy guiding every decision. Nothing about our approach was reckless. Every calculation had been made with careful attention to minimizing prolonged suffering, to resolving the engagement as swiftly and completely as possible, so that no extended period of conflict would be necessary. This was, I came to understand, the very heart of what Blackwood and the strategists around him meant by discipline. It was not restraint in the sense the Council understood it, careful half-measures designed to avoid offending anyone. It was the discipline of commitment, the understanding that drawing out an unavoidable engagement rarely served anyone well, and that swift, decisive resolution, however difficult to witness, ultimately caused far less harm than a prolonged, uncertain struggle. I met Lucas Ferris, the Resolute's tactical officer, during one of the final briefings before departure. He was a quiet, methodical man who had spent years studying historical conflicts, not for glory but for pattern recognition, searching for the lessons that generations before him had paid dearly to learn. He explained to me, as we reviewed the engagement parameters together, exactly what made our approach so different from anything the Council's proxy force would be prepared to face. Every trial in their recorded history, he said, tracing lines across a holographic display, follows a predictable rhythm. Both sides approach cautiously, exchange calculated shows of force, and gradually escalate toward a symbolic resolution that satisfies honor without causing lasting damage. It is, in essence, a performance choreographed by centuries of unspoken agreement about what a proper engagement should look like. And we are not going to perform, I said. Lucas nodded. We are going to resolve the matter as quickly and completely as the situation allows, using every legitimate advantage available to us. That is not recklessness, Ethan. That is exactly the kind of clarity that centuries of hard lessons taught our species to value. I found myself thinking often during those final preparations about what this engagement would mean beyond its immediate outcome. Grace had spoken to me privately about her concerns regarding how the wider galaxy might perceive us afterward, and I shared those concerns even as I understood the necessity of what we were about to do. We were not seeking to prove ourselves dangerous for its own sake. We were seeking to demonstrate unmistakably that humanity could not be dismissed, mocked, or managed the way the Council had clearly hoped to manage us. The journey to the designated engagement zone took several days, time I spent partly in preparation and partly in quiet reflection. I spoke often with Emma Hollies, a young engineering officer who had grown up hearing stories from her grandparents about a time before humanity had achieved the kind of unity that made interstellar travel possible. She reminded me during one of our conversations in the ship's mess hall that our history was not something to be ashamed of, despite how the Council had characterized it. They see our conflicts and assume instability, she said. They do not see the centuries we spent afterward learning, rebuilding, creating institutions specifically designed to prevent those mistakes from repeating. They judge us by our worst chapters, without acknowledging everything we built in response to them. I thought about that conversation often in the hours before we reached the engagement zone. It helped me understand something important about what we were truly demonstrating to the Council beyond simple military capability. We were showing them a species that had faced its own darkest tendencies directly, had suffered the consequences of failing to control them, and had emerged from that suffering with hard-earned discipline rather than hardened cruelty. It was, I came to believe, precisely this discipline that the Council was about to encounter, and precisely this discipline that their comfortable, careful histories had never required them to develop. When we finally arrived at the designated coordinates, the Council's proxy force was already assembled, arranged in a formation that Lucas identified immediately as ceremonial, designed for visual impact rather than tactical advantage. I stood on the bridge beside Blackwood as the Resolute sensors mapped their positions, and I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and solemn resolve settle over the crew around me. Blackwood studied the tactical display for a long moment before turning to address the bridge. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of the anger or bravado I might have expected given everything that had led us to this moment. Instead, it carried a quiet, measured certainty that reminded me why Earth Command had entrusted him with this responsibility. They believe they understand what is about to happen, he said. They have studied our species from a distance, drawn conclusions from incomplete records, and prepared for an engagement shaped entirely by their own expectations. We are not here to fulfill those expectations. We are here to answer them honestly, with everything our history has taught us about how such matters are properly resolved. He paused, glancing around the bridge at each officer in turn, and I felt the weight of his attention settle briefly on me before moving on. What happens next will be remembered, he continued, not because we sought conflict, but because we refused to accept being dismissed. Let us proceed with the discipline our history demands, and let the outcome speak for itself. I felt my pulse quicken as the order came to advance toward the engagement zone, the Resolute systems humming with a quiet readiness that seemed to match the resolve I felt building throughout the ship. Grace stood near the rear of the bridge, her expression composed, but her eyes fixed intently on the tactical display, watching the culmination of everything that had begun in that dismissive council chamber days earlier. I glanced briefly at the council proxy force, still holding their careful ceremonial formation, utterly unaware of how fundamentally different this engagement was about to be from anything their history had prepared them to expect. Somewhere among those distant ships, officers were likely reviewing the same predictable rhythms Lucas had described, anticipating a cautious, symbolic exchange that would satisfy honor without causing lasting consequence. They had no way of knowing that the species they were about to face had spent centuries learning exactly how such matters should truly be resolved, and that the quiet, measured resolve building throughout our fleet was about to answer their expectations in a way that would echo far beyond this single engagement, reshaping how the entire galaxy understood humanity for generations to come. The moment the engagement began, I understood immediately that everything Lucas had predicted about the Council's expectations was accurate, and everything Blackwood had planned for our response was about to prove decisive. The Council's proxy force advanced in their careful ceremonial formation, exactly as their centuries of tradition dictated. Their lead vessel broadcast a formal opening signal, a ritualized announcement that Lucas translated for the bridge as an invitation to begin the customary exchange of measured, symbolic engagement. It was, I realized, a system built entirely around mutual understanding, an unspoken agreement about how such matters were meant to unfold between civilized parties who valued careful restraint over decisive resolution. Blackwood did not respond to the signal. Instead, he gave a single, quiet order, and the Resolute systems engaged immediately. Our fleet advancing not in the cautious, symbolic manner the proxy force expected, but with the full, coordinated commitment of a force that intended to resolve this matter completely, without the extended ritual the Council had clearly anticipated. I watched the proxy formation's confusion register almost instantly across our sensor readings, their ships hesitating, shifting position in ways that suggested officers scrambling to understand why their carefully choreographed opening had gone unanswered. Lucas monitored their communications closely, and I could hear the confusion evident even through the clinical tone of the translated chatter. Officers questioning whether some technical error had occurred, whether the human fleet had somehow misunderstood the established protocol. They had not misunderstood anything. We understood the protocol perfectly. We had simply chosen not to honor it, because honoring it would have meant accepting a framework designed specifically to prevent us from demonstrating our actual capability. A framework built to keep the outcome safely predictable and comfortably survivable for everyone involved except us. What followed was swift, and I want to describe it carefully, because I believe how something is described matters as much as what actually occurred. Our fleet did not seek to cause unnecessary harm. Every tactical decision Blackwood made throughout the engagement was oriented toward disabling the proxy force's capability to continue, toward ending the matter as quickly and completely as possible, so that no extended period of continued conflict would be necessary. This was, as Lucas had explained to me days earlier, the very essence of the discipline our history had taught us. The understanding that decisive resolution, however difficult to witness in the moment, ultimately caused far less lasting harm than a prolonged, uncertain struggle drawn out to satisfy someone else's sense of ceremony. Still, the effect on the proxy force was overwhelming. Their formation, built for a slow, careful exchange, simply could not adapt quickly enough to a fleet that had committed fully from the very first moment of engagement. I watched their ships attempt to reorganize, attempt to fall back into more defensible positions, but the gap between their expectations and our actual approach proved too significant to overcome within the time frame available to them. Within a remarkably short period, the proxy force's capability to continue had been thoroughly neutralized. Blackwood gave the order to cease further action the moment this objective was achieved, unwilling to extend the engagement beyond what was strictly necessary to demonstrate the point we had come to make. I felt a strange mixture of relief and solemn weight settle over the bridge as the order was given, the crew around me exchanging quiet glances that carried more meaning than words could have conveyed. Grace approached the tactical display slowly, studying the aftermath with an expression I found difficult to read. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same measured calm I had come to associate with her, though I could hear something new beneath it, a kind of solemn recognition of what we had just accomplished. "They will not have a framework for understanding what just happened," she said quietly. "Every precedent in their history told them what to expect from an engagement like this. We have just shown them something their history never prepared them to anticipate." Lucas confirmed this within minutes, monitoring the flood of confused, urgent communications now passing between what remained of the Proxy force and their command structure elsewhere in Council space. The engagement had lasted a fraction of the time any previous trial of threshold in their recorded history had required, and the outcome bore no resemblance to the careful, symbolic resolutions that had defined every prior instance of the ritual. I found myself thinking in the quiet hours that followed about the silver-skinned delegate whose laughter had stayed with me since that first council session. I wondered whether he was among the officers now scrambling to understand what had occurred, whether the certainty he had displayed in that chamber was giving way to something far less comfortable. As reports of the engagement reached council space, Blackwood addressed the bridge crew once the immediate aftermath had been assessed, his tone carrying none of the triumph I might have expected given the significance of what we had just accomplished. Instead, he spoke with the same solemn clarity that had guided every decision throughout the preceding days. "We did not seek this outcome for the sake of proving a point through unnecessary display," he said. "We sought it because the alternative, accepting a framework designed to keep us permanently at a disadvantage, was never a genuine option for a species with our history. What we have demonstrated today is not simply capability. It is the discipline to use that capability decisively, and the restraint to conclude the matter the moment its purpose had been served." I thought about Emma's words from days earlier, about how the council judged us by our worst chapters without acknowledging what we had built in response to them. I believed, standing on that bridge in the quiet aftermath of the engagement, that we had just given the council an opportunity to see that response directly, whether they chose to understand it correctly or not. Claire Donovan's logistics teams began the careful work of assessing our own fleet condition, confirming what Blackwood's tactical planning had been designed to achieve from the outset. A resolution accomplished with minimal cost to our own forces, a decisive outcome reached without the extended, grinding conflict that a more cautious, ritualized approach might have inadvertently prolonged. As the immediate tension of the engagement began to settle, I found myself standing beside Grace near the observation viewport, watching the distant lights of the disabled Proxy force drift silently against the backdrop of unfamiliar stars. Neither of us spoke for a long while. "I keep thinking about that chamber," I finally said, "about how certain they all seemed that we would either refuse or fail." Grace nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the distant formation. "They built an entire framework around an assumption they never bothered to question, that a species with our history must be either too unstable to commit fully to anything, or too undisciplined to resolve a conflict decisively once committed. They never considered that our history might have taught us exactly the opposite lesson." I thought about that for a long moment before responding. "What happens now?" Grace turned to look at me, and for the first time since our initial return from the council homeworld, I saw something in her expression that resembled genuine uncertainty, not about what we had accomplished, but about how the wider galaxy would respond to it. "Now," she said quietly, "we find out whether the Council is capable of learning the same lesson we spent centuries learning ourselves. That true stability comes not from avoiding difficult choices, but from facing them honestly and resolving them with clarity. I suspect that lesson will prove far more difficult for them to accept than the engagement itself." I looked back out at the drifting remains of the Proxy formation, thinking about everything that had led us to this moment, the dismissive laughter in that ancient chamber, the quiet resolve that had built throughout our fleet in the days since, and the solemn, disciplined resolution we had just delivered in answer to an insult, none of us had asked for, but all of us had ultimately been prepared to meet. Whatever came next, I understood that something fundamental had shifted in how the galaxy would need to understand humanity going forward. We had not sought this confrontation, but we had answered it completely, and I suspected, standing there in the quiet aftermath, that the true consequences of that answer were only just beginning to unfold. Word of the engagement reached Council space faster than anyone aboard the Resolute anticipated, and the response that followed revealed something none of us had fully prepared for. The sheer scale of panic that a single decisive resolution could trigger across a civilization built entirely around careful, incremental caution. Within hours of the Proxy force's defeat, Lucas intercepted urgent communications attempting to invoke what the Council called an emergency ceasefire protocol, a mechanism apparently designed to halt any trial of threshold the moment its outcome threatened to exceed acceptable parameters. Blackwood reviewed the request personally, along with Grace and myself, in a brief meeting held in the Resolute's secondary command room. "They are asking us to stop," Blackwood said, studying the transmission with a calm that belied the significance of what it represented. "According to their own historical records, no trial has ever required this protocol before. The clause exists apparently, but has never once been invoked in the Council's recorded history." Grace read through the transmission carefully before responding. They assumed the framework itself would prevent any outcome extreme enough to require this option. They built a safeguard for a scenario they never genuinely expected to occur. I found myself studying the language of the request closely, noting how carefully it avoided any acknowledgement of what had actually happened, framing the situation instead as a technical irregularity, requiring correction, rather than an outcome that directly contradicted centuries of careful assumption about how such matters were meant to unfold. Blackwood's response, when it came, was measured but unambiguous. He informed the Council that the terms of engagement as originally presented to our delegation had made no mention of any mechanism permitting unilateral cessation, once the trial had formally begun. We had accepted the engagement as presented, and we would conclude it according to the same terms the Council itself had established without anticipating this outcome. The reaction across Council space, as Lucas continued monitoring available communications, proved immediate and far-reaching. What had begun as a single engagement intended by the Council, as a controlled demonstration of humanity's supposed instability, was rapidly becoming something far larger. A crisis that forced every member species to reconsider assumptions about the structures that had governed their relationships for centuries. I spent much of the following days working alongside Lucas and Claire, compiling reports on the shifting patterns emerging across Council space as word of the engagement spread. What we found was a galaxy in the early stages of genuine uncertainty. Member species that had long taken comfort in the predictable, ritualized nature of their shared governance, now confronting the reality that this framework had been thoroughly, unmistakably exposed as inadequate for handling a species that operated according to different principles entirely. Some species, Lucas explained during one of our briefings, began quietly recalling fleet assets from regions near the engagement zone, apparently unwilling to risk any proximity to a situation whose true implications remained unclear. Others, according to intercepted diplomatic communications, began urgently petitioning for private discussions with our delegation, eager to establish direct relationships with humanity independent of the Council's traditional structures. Grace found herself increasingly occupied with these approaches, fielding careful, tentative overtures from representatives of species who had shown us nothing but dismissive contempt only weeks earlier. I sat in on several of these exchanges, and I noticed a consistent pattern emerging. A shift from the confident condescension we had experienced in that initial chamber toward something far more cautious, almost deferential. One exchange in particular stayed with me. A representative from a species called the Visari, who had occupied a seat near the front of that original Council chamber, requested a private audience with Grace to discuss what she described as a reassessment of prior positions. I watched through the observation feed as the representative, whose posture during our first meeting had carried unmistakable superiority, now spoke with careful, measured caution, clearly working to establish goodwill without directly acknowledging how thoroughly her species' prior assumptions had been overturned. "We recognize," the representative said, her translated voice noticeably more restrained than I remembered, "that our initial assessment of your species may have been incomplete. We would welcome the opportunity to establish a more direct understanding, independent of the broader Council's traditional processes." Grace responded with the same measured diplomacy she had displayed throughout our entire mission. Neither vindictive nor overly conciliatory, simply direct. "Humanity remains open to genuine partnership," she said, "built on mutual respect, rather than convenient reassessment following an inconvenient outcome." I found myself admiring the precision of that response, the way it acknowledged the shift in the Visaris' position, without allowing them to simply erase the contempt they had shown us only weeks earlier. Grace understood better than most that the coming period would require careful navigation, that the galaxy's sudden willingness to reconsider its assumptions about humanity needed to be met with equal parts openness and appropriate caution. Not every response to the engagement carried this cautious, conciliatory tone. Lucas brought several intercepted communications to Blackwood's attention that revealed a very different reaction emerging among certain factions within the Council itself. Voices arguing forcefully for immediate, comprehensive containment measures against humanity, framing our demonstrated capability not as a misunderstanding to be corrected, but as a confirmed threat requiring urgent, decisive response. I remember the tension in the command room as Blackwood reviewed these communications, his expression carefully neutral even as the implications became clear. "They are dividing," he said finally. "Some see an opportunity for partnership. Others see confirmation of every fear our history seemed to justify." Grace nodded slowly, studying the same reports. This was always the risk. We demonstrated exactly what we needed to demonstrate, that we could not be dismissed or managed the way they intended. But that demonstration was always going to force a reckoning within their own structures, not just in how they perceived us. I asked her during a quiet moment later that evening whether she believed the Council could ultimately fracture entirely as a result of what we had done. She considered the question carefully before answering, her eyes fixed on the star charts glowing softly on the wall of her quarters. "I believe," she said slowly, "that we have exposed a fault line that already existed within their structure, one that had simply never been tested by circumstances significant enough to force it into the open. Whether that fault line leads to genuine reform or complete fragmentation, I honestly do not know. What I do know is that the Council which mocked us in that chamber only weeks ago no longer exists in the same form. Something new is emerging from what we set in motion, and I'm not certain even they understand yet what that will ultimately become." I thought often during those tense, uncertain days about how quickly everything had changed since our shuttle first docked at the Council homeworld. We had arrived seeking recognition and had instead encountered mockery. We had accepted a trial designed to humiliate us and had instead delivered an outcome that shattered the careful assumptions underlying an entire governing structure. Now, in the aftermath, we found ourselves at the center of a rapidly evolving situation whose ultimate direction remained genuinely uncertain, courted by some, feared by others, and watched closely by everyone across a galaxy that no longer knew quite what to make of us. Blackwood called a final briefing before our fleet began its return journey toward Earth, gathering the senior officers who had guided us through the preceding weeks. He spoke plainly, without the careful diplomatic language Grace typically favored, addressing the crew with the same measured honesty that had defined his leadership throughout the entire engagement. "What we accomplished here was necessary," he said, "but it was only the beginning of a much longer process. The Council's structure has been shaken in ways that will take considerable time to fully understand. Some among them will seek partnership. Others will seek to contain what they now perceive as a genuine threat. Our task going forward is to navigate this new reality with the same discipline that guided us through the engagement itself. Careful, decisive, and clear about who we are and what we stand for." I left that briefing with a quiet, unsettled feeling that stayed with me throughout our journey home. An awareness that the galaxy we were returning to inform was fundamentally different from the one we had left only weeks earlier, and that humanity's place within it was now a question with no simple or comfortable answer. Only a long, uncertain path forward that we would need to navigate with the same careful resolve that had carried us this far. I did not expect to return to Council space so soon after our departure, but 3 weeks after the Resolute arrived back in Earth's orbit, Grace received an urgent request for our delegation to attend an emergency session, one unlike any gathering the Council had convened in living memory. I stood beside her once again as our shuttle approached the same chamber that had greeted us with laughter and dismissal only weeks earlier, and I found myself struck by how different the atmosphere felt this time before we had even stepped through the doors. The chamber itself looked much the same, the pale humming stone, the raised platforms arranged in careful hierarchy, but the mood among the gathered delegates was unmistakably different. Gone was the easy confidence that had characterized our first visit. In its place, I sensed something closer to barely contained anxiety. Delegates speaking to one another in hushed, urgent tones, their attention shifting frequently toward the doors, watching for our arrival with an intensity that felt almost desperate. And this time we were not led to the bench. A platform had been prepared for us at the central level, positioned among the established members. It was a small thing, a raised platform, a designated position, a translator drone hovering at the appropriate distance. But it was a statement, and everyone in that chamber understood what it meant. Speaker Vex addressed the session, though his commanding presence from our first visit had given way to something more careful, more measured, a tone I recognized immediately as an attempt to manage a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond his control. The Council convenes this emergency session, he began, to address the unprecedented circumstances following the recent trial of Threshold, and to determine an appropriate path forward for relations between our governing body and the human delegation. I watched Grace closely as she listened, noting the careful neutrality she maintained despite the significance of the moment. This was, I understood, precisely the kind of situation she had spent her entire career preparing for, a moment requiring both firmness and restraint in equal measure. What followed was unlike anything I had witnessed during our first visit to that chamber. Rather than the unified, dismissive consensus that had greeted us weeks earlier, the session revealed deep and unmistakable divisions among the Council's member species. Some delegates argued forcefully for formal recognition of humanity's readiness for full Council membership, citing the engagement as definitive proof that our species possessed exactly the discipline and capability the trial of Threshold had originally been designed to assess. Others argued with equal intensity for immediate containment measures, framing the same engagement not as proof of readiness, but as confirmation of a threat too significant to be safely integrated into existing structures. I watched the silver-skinned delegate, whose laughter had stayed with me since our first visit, rise to address the chamber, his earlier confidence replaced by something far more careful, almost pleading. He argued at length for restrictive measures, citing humanity's demonstrated capability as justification for permanent limitations on our access to Council space and technology. His argument met with mixed reception. Some delegates nodding along in evident agreement, others visibly uncomfortable with the implications of what he was proposing. A representative I did not recognize, from a species with elongated features and a translated voice that carried unusual warmth, rose to offer a starkly different perspective. She argued that humanity's demonstrated discipline, far from justifying containment, represented precisely the kind of capability the Council should be seeking to integrate as an ally, rather than isolate as a threat, particularly given uncertainties she alluded to, but did not fully explain regarding pressures facing the wider galaxy from beyond Council space entirely. I glanced at Grace during this exchange, catching a flicker of genuine interest in her expression, a recognition that this final point carried implications beyond the immediate matter at hand. She would later explain to me that she believed certain factions within the Council were beginning to see humanity not merely as a newly arrived species to be managed, but as a potential asset against threats the Council's traditional members had perhaps grown too comfortable and too cautious to properly address on their own. The session continued for hours, delegates arguing back and forth across positions that seemed to shift and reshape themselves as the discussion progressed. I watched entire factions that had presented unified fronts weeks earlier now fracture into competing subgroups, each pursuing what they perceived as their own species' best interest in a rapidly destabilizing situation that none of them had fully anticipated. Speaker Vex attempted repeatedly to guide the session towards some form of consensus, but the divisions proved too significant to resolve within a single gathering. Eventually, recognizing the impossibility of reaching unified agreement, he turned the discussion directly toward Grace, inviting our delegation to formally state humanity's position regarding the path forward. Grace rose slowly, and the chamber fell into a silence far more attentive than anything I had witnessed during our first visit. When she spoke, her voice carried the same measured clarity that had guided our delegation through every stage of this extraordinary sequence of events. Humanity did not seek this outcome, she said. We arrived at this council seeking recognition and partnership, offered instead only dismissal and a trial designed, we now understand, to keep us permanently at a disadvantage within your structures. We accepted the trial honestly, according to the terms your own council established, and we resolved it according to principles our history taught us through considerable hardship. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle across the chamber before continuing. We do not seek to dominate this council, nor do we seek isolation from it. We seek genuine partnership built on honest recognition of who we are rather than convenient assumptions drawn from incomplete understanding. Whether this council can offer that partnership, or whether it remains committed to structures designed to keep newcomers permanently subordinate, is a question only you can answer. But I would caution every delegate in this chamber against mistaking our restraint for weakness, just as you once mistook our history for instability. Both mistakes, I suspect, would prove equally costly. The silence that followed her statement stretched long enough that I found myself genuinely uncertain how the chamber would respond. Eventually, Speaker Vex rose again, his expression carrying none of the practiced confidence from our first meeting, replaced instead by the careful weight of someone navigating circumstances far beyond anything his experience had prepared him to manage. The council will require additional time, he said finally, to determine an appropriate path forward. This session is adjourned, pending further deliberation among member species. As we made our way back toward our shuttle, escorted this time by delegates whose demeanor bore little resemblance to the dismissive contempt we had encountered weeks earlier, I found myself reflecting on everything that had unfolded since our very first visit to this chamber. We had arrived as outsiders, seeking recognition from beings who considered us barely worth their attention. We had endured mockery, humiliation, and a trial designed specifically to keep us subordinate. And through it all, we had answered not with anger or vengeance, but with the same disciplined clarity that our history, difficult as it had been, had ultimately taught us to value above all else. Grace walked beside me in thoughtful silence for much of the journey back to our shuttle, and I sensed she was turning over the same questions occupying my own mind. Uncertainty about what would come next, about whether the fractures we had exposed within the council's structure would ultimately lead toward genuine partnership, or toward a far more complicated and uncertain future. Whatever happens next, she finally said as we boarded the shuttle, I believe we have already accomplished something significant. We have shown this council, and every species watching from beyond it, that humanity cannot be dismissed, mocked, or managed according to assumptions that were never true to begin with. That alone, I believe, was worth everything we endured to achieve it. I nodded in quiet agreement, watching through the viewport as the council homeworld receded behind us, its ancient chamber now the site of divisions and uncertainties that would likely reshape relationships across known space for generations to come. Whatever form those changes ultimately took, I understood that humanity's place within this wider galaxy had been permanently and irrevocably altered by everything that had unfolded since that first dismissive meeting weeks earlier. And that the true consequences of that transformation were only just beginning to reveal themselves. A year passed before I truly understood the full scope of what had changed, not just for humanity, but for every species that had once found comfort in the Council's careful, predictable order. I stood on the observation deck of a newly commissioned vessel, larger and more capable than the Resolute had ever been, watching a formation of ships bearing Earth's insignia hold position near a system that only a year earlier none of us had ever heard mentioned in any human record. Diplomatic outposts now marked our presence across a growing network of alliances, Agreements negotiated not from a position of desperate hope for recognition, but from genuine mutual respect, earned through everything our delegation had endured and answered in that distant council chamber. Grace had remained deeply involved throughout the intervening months, traveling between newly established partnerships with a tireless dedication that left little time for rest. I saw her less frequently now, our paths crossing mainly during formal briefings, where she updated command on the shifting landscape of relationships across what had once been exclusively council territory. During one such briefing, she described how thoroughly the old order had fractured in the months following our emergency session. The council itself, she explained, had never fully recovered its former unity. Some member species had pursued the partnership the forward-thinking delegate had argued for, establishing direct, independent relationships with humanity that bypassed the council's traditional structures entirely. Others had doubled down on containment efforts, forming their own smaller coalition dedicated to managing what they still perceived as an unpredictable and dangerous new presence in the galaxy. The result was not the single, coherent authority that had once governed relationships across known space, but a complicated, evolving patchwork of alliances and rivalries. Each faction navigating a landscape reshaped fundamentally by what had begun as a single dismissive meeting. I had been reassigned during this period to serve aboard a diplomatic liaison vessel, tasked with maintaining communication between Earth Command and the growing number of species now seeking direct relationships with humanity. It was through this role that I met Noah Whitfield, a fellow liaison officer who had spent considerable time studying how other species across this fractured landscape now viewed us, gathering perspectives from allies and cautious skeptics alike. They study us differently now, he told me during one of our shared assignments, reviewing reports compiled from a dozen different systems, not with the dismissive curiosity from before, but with genuine effort to understand what actually drives us. Our history, once viewed purely as evidence of instability, is increasingly studied as a case study in how difficult lessons, properly learned, can produce genuine discipline rather than simple caution. I thought often during those months about the silver-skinned delegate whose contempt had stayed with me since our very first visit to that council chamber. I learned eventually through reports passed along by Grace that his faction had ultimately lost significant influence within the fractured council. Their calls for strict containment measures increasingly viewed by more moderate factions as counterproductive, likely to push humanity further toward the independent alliances that many species now seemed eager to cultivate. I had the opportunity during one diplomatic visit to a newly allied system to speak with Claire Donovan again, now overseeing logistics coordination for an expanding network of joint ventures between Earth and several partner species. She reflected during our conversation on how strange it felt to watch relationships built on genuine mutual respect emerge from what had begun as such an openly hostile encounter. I think about that first meeting sometimes, she said. How certain they all seemed that we would either refuse the trial or fail it completely. I wonder if they ever truly understood what they were setting in motion by underestimating us so completely. I considered her question carefully before responding, drawing on everything I had witnessed since that first humiliating session in the council chamber. I think, I said slowly, they understood exactly what kind of species they believed they were dealing with, based on everything their careful, comfortable histories had taught them to expect. What they never understood was that our history taught us something entirely different. And that difference was always going to define how we answered them, regardless of how the engagement itself unfolded. Emma Hollies, whom I encountered again during a joint engineering project between Earth and one of our newer allies, shared a similar reflection during a quiet evening spent reviewing technical specifications together. She had grown in the intervening months into a senior role, overseeing collaborative development projects between human engineers and their counterparts from partner species. My grandparents used to tell me stories, she said, about a time before humanity achieved real unity, before we learned to work together across every difference that once divided us. I used to think those stories were simply history, lessons about mistakes we had already corrected. Now I understand they were something more. They were the foundation for exactly the discipline that carried us through everything that followed that first council meeting. I found myself reflecting often during quiet moments aboard the liaison vessel on Blackwood's words from the earliest days of our preparation, about restraint meaning decisive action rather than hesitant avoidance, about the true purpose of discipline being clarity rather than caution. I understood now, having witnessed the full arc of everything that had unfolded since that first dismissive meeting, exactly how right he had been. Grace requested my presence one final time before my current assignment concluded, inviting me to join her aboard a small transport for what she described only as an important visit. I did not learn our destination until we had already departed, discovering with some surprise that we were returning once more to the Council homeworld, now operating under a significantly altered governance structure following months of internal negotiation among its remaining, more moderate factions. The chamber itself, when we finally arrived, felt entirely different from either of our previous visits. Gone was the dismissive confidence of our first encounter, and gone too was the anxious uncertainty of our emergency session months later. In its place, I sensed something closer to careful, measured respect. Delegates greeting our arrival with formal acknowledgement rather than either contempt or barely concealed anxiety. Speaker Vex, still presiding over what remained of the Council's authority, addressed our delegation with language markedly different from anything I had heard him use during our earlier visits. The Council formally recognizes humanity's standing among the community of independent sovereign species operating within known space, he said, extending full diplomatic recognition and inviting continued partnership on terms established through mutual respect rather than unilateral assessment. I watched Grace accept this formal recognition with the same measured composure she had displayed throughout every stage of this extraordinary journey, neither triumphant nor overly conciliatory, simply direct in her acknowledgement of an outcome earned through everything our species had endured and answered since that very first dismissive meeting. As we prepared to depart the chamber for what I understood would likely be one of many future visits, now conducted on genuinely equal terms, I found myself reflecting on the full arc of everything that had transpired since I first stepped through those chamber doors as a junior communications officer, watching alien delegates laugh openly at a species they believed they understood completely. They had not understood us at all. They had judged us by incomplete records and comfortable assumptions, never considering that a species forged through genuine hardship might emerge from that hardship with discipline rather than instability, with clarity rather than chaos. They had confused restraint with hesitation, conflict with chaos, and scars with weakness. They had looked at everything we had survived and concluded that we were fragile, when the truth was that everything they saw as evidence of our weakness was, in fact, evidence of our strength. We had answered their dismissal not with anger for its own sake, but with the same measured resolve that our difficult history had taught us to value above all else. And in doing so, we had reshaped not only how the galaxy understood humanity, but how an entire governing structure understood the very nature of readiness and respect. Standing once more on that observation deck, watching the Council homeworld recede behind us for what felt like the final time in this particular chapter of our story, I understood that humanity's place among the stars had been permanently transformed by everything we had endured and answered since that first dismissive meeting. We had not sought this transformation. We had simply refused to accept being dismissed. And in refusing, we had shown an entire galaxy exactly what centuries of hard-earned discipline could accomplish when finally given a legitimate reason to act. Whatever challenges remained ahead, and I understood there would be many, I carried with me a quiet confidence forged through everything I had witnessed, that humanity, whatever else the galaxy chose to believe about us, would meet those challenges with the same measured clarity that had carried us this far, and that no one, having witnessed what we had already accomplished together, would ever again make the mistake of underestimating exactly what we were capable of when finally given the chance to prove it. The stars outside the viewport looked the same as they always had, distant, indifferent, ancient beyond comprehension, but something in how I saw them had changed. They were no longer a void to be crossed in search of recognition. They were a territory in which humanity had earned its place, not through the trial that the Council had designed for our humiliation, but through the centuries of suffering, learning, and growth that had prepared us to answer that trial with the quiet, devastating precision of a species that had been preparing for this moment, since before it knew such a moment would come. The Council had given us a trial. We had given them a lesson, and the galaxy, I suspected, was only beginning to learn it.